So welcome back, everybody. This is Paul Smyers again. In case you don't know, I'm a practicing real estate professional in southwestern Virginia. And I also did a lot of aerial photography earlier in my life as a photographer. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about subdividing and dividing up land and parcels and so on. And as I mentioned in my other land videos, that a lot of people don't really know much about buying and selling land because maybe they've never done it. But just to give you a little idea, there's a lot of reasons why people buy land. And here in Virginia, we have a very large variety of terrain. We have some fairly steep areas that are rocky and basically very hard to use for any purpose. We have an awful lot of farmland and fields and forest, and we have a lot of different kinds of timber growing around here. We have a lot of pine that is actually harvested, and then there's still some old hardwoods, and here and there you still see some very large hardwood trees. I have one right near me that's about 4 or 5 feet in diameter. So you get some really large good lumber in parts of Virginia, and we also have an awful lot of streams, and there's not as many. There are some natural lakes and ponds, but the river, there's a lot of hills in Virginia, so you find the water's rushing pretty fast, so it doesn't, if you build a dam or if you try to have a pond somewhere, that there's a good likelihood that you'll have some input that you'll have to deal with. So getting back to the subject here of dividing up land. Now, when you look at the parcel maps online, some people know how to do this. You go to the GIS system that's online. GIS is Graphic Information System, and every county in the country has it. There's satellite photographs there, there's floodplains, there's all kinds of amazing information there that you can get in layers. But you'll see the town has every different parcel in the whole county is laid out there. And sometimes you look at these plots of land and go, wow, that's a really weird shape. How'd that happen? You see, and then other areas, especially certain parts of the country, you'll see the plots of map are like they're exact rectangles, because all they did is like, okay, the land is flat, so we just go 200 yards that way, 200 yards this way, we'll just make a big square, we'll call it that piece of property. Out here in Virginia, it gets a lot more complicated than that. And then you have the situation where you have, if a piece of land is near a stream or a river, even a fairly small stream, say 20 feet wide, wow, typically the land is separated. They say the middle of the river is where the boundary is. But that stream can go this way or that, as you know, because you get a little heavy rainfall and so on and flooding, and next thing you know, that channel is changing. So that happens a lot too in parcels of Virginia. So there's lots of different parcels in Virginia, and over the years, a long time ago, before the Westerners came here, all this land, of course, the natives who lived here, they didn't really have firm boundaries. They didn't survey like we did, so they had their certain terrain or certain tribes, a certain area, but they didn't have this whole concept of the European style of cutting up the land into chunks. And so when they come to mountains, they have to make these boundaries and everything and figure out where, river doesn't go straight. So, okay, well, this land is like got a crooked side on one side and maybe the other three sides are straight. But over a period of time, people sell land and they will it to their children. A long time ago, people used to live like in a farm estate. You had at least 40 acres. You had like a lot of land that you could have your horses to power. Back before they had even steam engines, and then they had to feed the horses, so they have hay. You got to have water. You got to have wood for your stove and firewood and so on. So there's a lot of homesteading that was done in the state of Virginia for a really long time. And typically a family might stay on a large piece of land for a really long time, but then slowly but surely, those people go off the city, and then they decide that they don't need 100 acres, so they'll sell 40 or something, and little by little, it comes down, and you see near a lot of towns on the zoning maps, you'll see a whole lot of little tiny parcels, like maybe 1 acre or 2 acres. Now, Virginia has an awful lot of land that is in large parcels and some of it is not very usable really because it's very steep and rocky or completely wooded and so on. But on the other hand, there are areas that do have very, very lush. There's some good wineries, and wine grows well in Virginia, and there's quite a bit of tobacco. So there's very, very fertile soil and plenty of sun and a pretty long growing season. So, excuse me, in this state, you have that. Now, when it comes to subdividing, as I've said, their towns will eventually say, well, okay, well, back in the railroad towns, they would like, okay, everybody lives in town near the railroad, okay, and maybe even worked on the railroad, so they wanted to stay pretty close to town, so they had like a lot of lots that are maybe like, you see these houses from the old days where they're like side by side, they're literally no division, they're just like right next to each other to pack them all in. Well, they still do that to a certain extent in different ways in the city. You get packed in and everything, and they go have the big stores in the bottom, and then they pack them in upstairs. So, but out in the outlying areas like in Virginia, rural areas, there's these large parcels, and various times there were easements and things that happened that made permissions for someone to use a piece of land. I talked about that in another segment here. But regarding subdivision, if you have a piece of land and you want to subdivide it, it's very, very possible. They have incredible surveying equipment now that's done by satellites, not as difficult as it used to be. It still costs quite a bit if it's a large property, but they have facilities now that get some very, very accurate measurements of where the boundaries are of any property. And if you have a piece of property that you want to divide and you want to survey it and you want to divide it, you want to cut it with the least problem, well, the easiest way to do is like to cut one straight line across it, like a laser-like line all the way across from one side, but that's not always possible. Now, when you divide land, you want to be courteous. You don't want to just say, okay, I got my frontage over here and I'll keep this parcel, but I'll try to sell that one over there that has no access. That's not a very good way. So the town doesn't like people who, well, let's say there's a certain amount of politics involved, but there's a certain amount of practical thinking that say, look, we don't want a really big piece of choice piece of land that has no way to get in there. There's no road access, see? So typically when you divide land, if you want to divide it, you need to have to give the person that you're selling to a way to get to their land effectively, you see, and then it's a much more valuable piece of land. So again, surveying is not too difficult, but then there's a question of house size, because if you're living in the country, most people who go out the country, they don't really want to live with another house 100 feet away. So the lot size, I would say even in a town, is usually a minimum of 1 acre. 1 acre is 200 or so feet by 200 and so feet, roughly. So, but in the countryside, if you have 4 or 5 acres, you might have more features. You have room for, say, a pond or sheds or barns or fencing or cattle or anything like that, even on a 5-acre piece. So typically in the old days, the old homesteads, they would have one part was the wood. That was they used for the firewood. They had an area where they have to grow hay for their horses and their livestock, or they have to have some pasture land or something. And then they have the utility area where, you know, they do all the machinery stored, sheds or something like that, a barn. And then they have their home. And there's a lot of old homesteads out in the countryside, but maybe there's on one area of like 100-acre piece, there might be a really great homestead that, 8 or 9 acres. And the people say, well, look, I don't really want to pay the taxes on these other 90 acres. I'm fine with my 10 here, or maybe even keep 20. So what am I going to do? Can I sell some of the land? Yeah, keep in mind that you got to leave some road frontage. And if there is no road frontage, then you're going to have an easement that's going to be through your property, the driveway. They're going to have to be able to get up to the property. And then think about also, if you buy a piece of property and it's already very big, you can go in with the idea, say, look, I don't need that piece of property, but it does have some good hardwood lumber on it. So I'm going to own the property for a while. I'll harvest all the lumber and I'll sell it for whatever I can get for it. And then I'll prepare it somewhat for a future owner, and then I'm going to sell that. So you can go in having an idea that you can make some money with the piece of property that you're buying. by subdividing it later, given some very careful logical and practical thinking and financial thinking about what your intentions are to get a subdivision. If you try to get like a really strange subdivision and do something really crazy with the land, or leave some guy no access, then the town's going to say, I don't know, maybe we don't want to deal with that. But if you just make a practical, say, look, I'm going to make a very smart decision about how I'm going to divide this land, and the land that I'm selling is going to be a nice piece of land. It won't get stuck, and nobody's ever going to buy it. So, again, thoughtfulness goes a long way in trying to get your way with the town boards and the neighbors and so on. Because if you buy a piece of land that has been sitting next to somebody for a long time, this happened to my friend of mine. He raised his kids. There's a huge field right behind his house, and his kids played there and everything, and he'd have to pay taxes on it. And then after the kids got a little older, they started building a development. Now there's this huge bunch of old townhouses there, and all the lights are on all the time, and it's just a nuisance. I mean, it's not even fun to look at. So that's the kind of stuff that happens. So I'm a very strong advocate of preserving land and homesteads and prepping and that sort of thing. So I see I made the video a little bit long, and I don't want to bore you, but that's a little bit about dividing and subdividing homes, land. So thanks again.